They laughed at us that morning. I remember the echo of it through the radio static, a strange metallic laughter carried across frozen air 30,000 feet above France. April 8th, 1943, the day the Luftwaffe still believed the sky belonged to them. Their ace, Oberleutnant Ralph Hermchen, leaned in his cockpit, lips curled in mock amusement as he looked down at the rising shapes below. 16 of us, climbing clumsily in a slow, sweating ascent. The new American machines. The ones they called flying milk bottles. The air was knife-thin at 27,000 feet. You could taste metal through the oxygen mask and smell oil bleeding from the Pratt & Whitney engine. My hands trembled on the throttle not from fear, but from the raw vibration that passed through the fuselage, a living thing, heavy and defiant. Below us, France stretched like a patchwork quilt under enemy occupation. Above, sunlight flashed off the curved wings of Focke-Wulf, 190 seconds, circling like predators. I heard one German voice, distorted through radio intercept, drawling, "The Americans have sent us their tractors." His laughter cut off only when the static cracked with incoming chatter, our major's voice breaking through like gravel. "Keep formation. Don't chase. Don't climb with them." Major Don Blakesley, our commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, knew what most of us didn't yet understand, that the plane we flew wasn't built to dance. It was built to endure. The P-47 Thunderbolt was 7 tons of forged willpower, a blunt-nosed juggernaut meant not to outturn or outclimb, but to outlast. Its 2,000 horsepower R-2800 double Wasp engine didn't sing like the Spitfire's Merlin. It growled, shaking the stick like a living animal. The engineers at Republic Aviation had created something monstrous and new, a machine that would rewrite every rule the Germans worshipped. At that moment, though, we didn't know any of that. We just knew it climbed like a drunk elephant. From the German cockpits above, we must have looked ridiculous, wide-bodied, barrel-chested silhouettes lumbering upward through clouds. Our wings seemed too short, our fuselages too fat. But within those swollen wings waited mathematics the Germans hadn't calculated. 8 Browning, 50 caliber guns, each loaded with 425 rounds of metal certainty. 3,400 rounds total. 6,000 pieces of lead per minute, ready to carve anything that crossed our sights into flame and aluminum dust. I remember catching a glimpse of sunlight through my canopy, sharp, blinding, cutting through the thin haze, and for a second, I saw one of their 190 seconds banking, wings glinting like polished knives. He was beautiful, I admitted. The enemy's machine had the grace of a predator. Ours had the strength of a storm. I thought of that as sweat crawled down my temple inside the freezing mask. "Eyes up!" Blakesley's voice again. "They're forming for attack." I felt my stomach twist. Somewhere beyond the clouds, German laughter faded into clipped commands. The first bursts of cannon fire streaked the air, yellow flashes against the blue. I remember the sound of metal tapping my fuselage like hail. Then the realization that it was enemy fire. I rolled hard right, the horizon tilting into madness. The Thunderbolt didn't respond like a dancer. It lunged. But it stayed alive. In that first chaotic minute, our formation broke apart, replaced by instinct. Someone screamed over the radio. Someone else cursed. I don't remember who. All I know is that when I looked again, one of our birds was trailing smoke, falling, spiraling into the clouds below. A rookie named Fisher. Gone. The German fighters looped overhead, perfectly synchronized, their movements precise, elegant, or cruel. For every one of ours they had a dozen veterans. They thought that made them gods. They didn't yet understand that war is not decided by elegance, it's decided by endurance. Later, long after that day, historians would write that April 8th marked the beginning of the end of the Luftwaffe's supremacy. But none of us knew that in the moment. We were just boys in heavy metal beasts, breathing canned oxygen and faith. We were told to climb, and we did, until our heads ached and our engines screamed. Somewhere beneath the roar, I could still hear faint laughter over the enemy radio, a last trace of arrogance hanging in the cold sky. If only they had known what was coming, the months when those same flying milk bottles would rain storms of lead across Europe, when that laughter would die in mid-sentence, choked by the sound of 8 Brownings singing together. That morning above Caen they saw only a clumsy new fighter. What they didn't see was the storm taking shape, the storm that would erase their air force. We reached altitude. The world below turned to a blue-gray haze, and in that silence between heartbeats, I whispered to myself, "Laugh while you can." The thunder was about to learn to speak. I sometimes think the P-47 was born out of fear, not the kind that makes men run, but the kind that forces them to build. June 1940, the world was collapsing. France was burning, Britain was gasping for breath, and across the Atlantic, engineers at Republic Aviation were staring at a set of desperate blueprints stamped with one simple demand from the U.S. Army Air Corps: build us something that can meet the Luftwaffe head-on. Alexander Kartveli was the man who took that order. A Georgian immigrant, with the stubbornness of an anvil and the accent of a dreamer, he walked into the design hangar in Farmingdale, New York, and said quietly, "We will not match them. We will surpass them." His assistants thought he was mad. The paper specifications already looked impossible: a high-altitude interceptor with a turbo-supercharged radial engine and the armor of a tank. Yet Kartveli just smiled, tapping the drafting table with his pencil. "It will be a dinosaur," he admitted, "but a dinosaur with good proportions." That dinosaur would change the war. The XP-47B prototype that rolled out on the 6th of May 1941 looked like nothing anyone had ever seen. It was huge, nearly 10,000 pounds empty, 65% heavier than its predecessor, the P-43 Lancer. The rear fuselage bulged with the tubing of the turbo-supercharger, a maze of aluminum arteries carrying breath to a monstrous heart. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 18 cylinders arranged in twin rows, 2,000 horsepower, waiting to tear the air apart. When the test pilot first saw it, he laughed. "You sure this thing's supposed to fly?" But it did. It roared down the runway, tail lifting, heavy yet alive, and when it left the ground, it climbed with a defiance that felt almost human. At 27,000 feet, where German engines gasped, the Double Wasp still sang. The turbo-supercharger fed it the same power it had at sea level. Engineers on the ground stared at the contrails curling high above and realized they had built something that shouldn't exist and yet did. Then came the deaths. Bridgeport, Connecticut, 1,942. Major Hubert Hub Zemke and the 56th Fighter Group were handed the first operational Thunderbolts. They expected glory. What they got was chaos. Between September 42 and January 43, 18 pilots died and 41 aircraft were reduced to burning wrecks before they even met an enemy. The P-47 torqued on takeoff, flipped on landing, dove like a stone until control froze solid from compressibility. It killed more Americans in training than Germans would in its first months of combat. We cursed it, feared it, and still climbed back into it. I remember one mechanic, an old farmer from Iowa named Mason, wiping oil from his hands after another crash and muttering, "This plane don't forgive mistakes." He was right. The Thunderbolt demanded respect before it gave back loyalty. It was heavy, unpredictable, and angry, but inside its fury was power no pilot had ever known. Those who survived the first months learned to treat it not as a machine, but as a force of nature. Lieutenant Robert Johnson was one of them, a quiet farm boy from Oklahoma, more comfortable fixing tractors than fighting Germans. His first takeoff in a P-47 nearly killed him. "It was like strapping yourself to a locomotive," he said later. "You didn't fly it, you aimed it." And that was exactly what Kartveli had intended, not grace, but purpose. The engineers called it overbuilt. The pilots called it indestructible. The airframe could absorb cannon hits that would have shattered any Spitfire. Its radial engine didn't bleed coolant, it bled courage. And beneath that armor, in the heart of the design, was a kind of faith, the belief that brute force, multiplied by American industry, could compensate for inexperience and chaos. Those early months were agony. Training fields littered with wreckage, telegrams sent to mothers before the war even began. Yet, in the hangars, you could sense something shifting. Each time a mechanic found a new way to tune the turbo lines, each time a pilot wrestled it back from a dive that should have killed him, the legend grew. The monster was learning to walk. One night in December 1942, Zemke stood in the hangar watching rain drip off the P-47's broad wings. "She's too big," one pilot said beside him. "Too heavy, too dumb." Zemke didn't look away. "She's not dumb," he said quietly. "She's waiting for the right sky." And when that sky came April 1943, over France, the world would finally understand what Kartveli had built. Not a failure, not a freak, but a weapon forged from steel and stubbornness. The kind of weapon that didn't have to dance with death to win, it just had to outlast it. That night, the rain hissed against the hangar roof like static, and the mechanics kept working under the floodlights, tightening bolts, wiping down aluminum skins. None of us knew it yet, but the beast in front of us was about to roar. The first time we met the Luftwaffe in open sky, it felt like walking into a classroom full of masters armed only with textbooks. They had been fighting since 1939, over Poland, over France, over the Channel and Russia, while most of us still smelled of new uniforms and nervous sweat. We were flying machines we barely trusted, into a war we didn't yet understand. April and May of 1943 were the months when the Thunderbolt began its painful education. We went up proud and came back humbled. The Germans were right, we couldn't turn with their Focke-Wulfs, couldn't climb with their Messerschmitts. When their fighters appeared, they came from below, fast and hungry, forcing tight spirals where our heavy wings screamed under the strain. We called for help, but help came only in static and smoke. From their cockpits, the German aces mocked us. Josef Pips Priller, commander of JG-26, radioed back to his base after one such fight, amused and confident. "The new American fighter is meat for the slaughter," he said. "It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, and climbs like a pregnant cow." Even the British, watching from their Spitfires, made jokes. One RAF pilot told me over dinner that the best evasive maneuver in a P-47 was to unstrap and run around the cockpit. We laughed with him bitterly because he wasn't wrong. Our first month in Europe told a brutal truth. 14 Thunderbolts lost, 3 confirmed kills. We were learning how to die faster than how to fight. But what no one yet understood, not even the Germans, laughing over French skies, was what these machines could survive. On May 4th, one of ours limped back to base after a dogfight over the coast. When it touched down, we counted 21 cannon holes and more than 100 machine gun strikes across the fuselage. The wings were torn, the skin peeled like bark after fire. Any Spitfire or 109 would have fallen apart mid-air. The Thunderbolt had kept flying, its radial engine fat, ugly, blessedly air-cooled, didn't bleed a drop of coolant. The oil was thick and black, but it was still turning. The pilot climbed out, trembling, oil-soaked, and said only, "She won't quit." That sentence spread faster than any victory report. She won't quit. I still remember that hangar smell: cordite, fuel, and fear. The mechanics worked in silence, patching holes, replacing panels, whispering among themselves. One of them ran a hand along the bullet-scarred wing and said, half to himself, "This plane can take more than any man." It was true. When the Thunderbolt hit back, even once, it hit like God's hammer. 8 Brownings firing in perfect sync didn't just wound, they erased. We started noticing it during skirmishes. A German pilot who misjudged a dive wandered into the convergence zone of those 8 guns 6 feet wide, invisible until it erupted, was gone before we could blink. There was no spiral down, no bailout, just sudden absence. We learned that we didn't need to fight their way, we only needed one clean moment to aim. Still, most days ended the same. Smoke trails, empty chairs at the mess hall, names crossed off rosters. The laughter from the Germans continued, and maybe they were entitled to it for now. They didn't yet know that the same metal they mocked was teaching us, adapting with every mission, becoming stronger each time it bled. Every pilot has a moment when he stops fearing death and starts fearing failure. Ours came in June, when we realized the Thunderbolt wasn't our enemy, impatience was. The big plane didn't respond to panic. It demanded trust. You had to feel the weight, use it, let the dive carry you like gravity's ally, not its victim. You couldn't fight in circles. You had to fight in lines, brutal, straight, decisive. By the end of that month, the laughter in the Luftwaffe ready rooms began to fade. Reports came in of American fighters that refused to fall, of flying tanks that shrugged off cannon fire. And somewhere, deep in occupied France, one young German pilot reportedly said after a battle, "They don't fly well, but they don't die either." He was closer to the truth than he knew. We were still losing, but we were learning. Every hole patched, every pilot buried, every dive pulled at the last second was part of the same grim education. The P-47 was becoming what Cartvelli promised, a machine that could take anything the enemy threw and still come home. It was only a matter of time before one of us would prove it beyond doubt. There are days in war that feel written before they happen. June 26, 1943, was one of those. The air above Lisieux, France, shimmered with sunlight so clean it hurt the eyes, the kind of deceptive beauty that makes men forget they are about to die. 48 Thunderbolts were returning from escort duty, their engines a dull, synchronized thunder. And at the tail end of that formation flew a young lieutenant named Robert S. Johnson, 23 years old, quiet, methodical, carrying a Bible in his breast pocket and a fear he refused to name. The German attack came from the sun. 16 Focke-Wulfs, diving at impossible speed, led by Hauptmann Wilhelm Galland, the younger brother of the famous Adolf. They hit us like falling stars, silent until the first cannon shells tore through the formation. Johnson's plane took the worst of it. 20-millimeter rounds ripped across the fuselage. The canopy exploded. Hydraulic fluid sprayed into his face like scalding rain. The cockpit filled with smoke and the smell of burning insulation. His leg burned. He thought it was on fire, but it was shrapnel, hot and wet. He tried to bail out. The canopy wouldn't budge. A shell had welded the track shut. Trapped at 27,000 feet in a dying machine, Johnson realized the only way out was through. He kicked the rudder hard, leveled the wings, and whispered, "Not yet." The engine shook so violently he thought it would tear free of its mounts. Instruments flickered and died. He could barely see through the oil-smeared glass. Still, he pointed the nose west toward England, toward home. When you talk to pilots about courage, they'll tell you it's not about heroics. It's about not giving up while you still have choices. Johnson had none. The Focke-Wulfs swarmed behind him, their cannons flashing, tracers slicing the air like glowing knives. A shell burst inches from his head, peppering the armor plate behind his seat. The Thunderbolt shuddered, then steadied, wounded, bleeding, but alive. He was flying a miracle, held together by faith and rivets. Then came the final visitor. A lone German fighter fell in behind him, one of Galland's men. Historical reports never named him. No one ever found the wreck. He was young, probably 21 or 22, with blonde hair visible through the canopy. He lined up perfectly behind Johnson's crippled plane and fired. Cannon shells hammered the fuselage. Machine gun rounds rattled through the tail. Johnson hunched behind the armor, teeth clenched, waiting for the end. But it didn't come. When the Germans' ammunition ran dry, he closed in beside Johnson's shattered cockpit. For a moment, their eyes met through cracked glass and open sky, two men suspended between life and disbelief. The German shook his head slowly, almost respectfully, then raised one gloved hand in salute before peeling away into the clouds. Johnson's engine finally died as he crossed the English coast. He glided the last few miles, wheels locked, half-blind and bleeding. The plane hit the runway at Manston like a stone, bounced once, and rolled to a stop, trailing smoke. Mechanics ran toward it, shouting, their boots splashing in the spilled oil. When they saw the damage, they fell silent. One counted bullet holes until he reached 200 and stopped, hands shaking. The armor plate behind Johnson's seat was bent inward like a dented shield. The control cables were half severed. The engine cowling was gone. The canopy was welded into a mangled halo of metal. And yet the Thunderbolt had brought its pilot home. When engineers studied the wreck, they realized even they had underestimated what they'd built. The Germans refused to believe the reports. No aircraft could take that much punishment, they said, until their own pilots swore it was true. From that day forward, something shifted in the air war. The laughter stopped. The enemy began to look twice before diving on a P-47. I imagined Johnson sitting alone that night, still in his flight suit, hands raw from gripping the controls, hearing the ticking of cooling metal outside. He probably didn't think of himself as a hero. He'd just done what pilots do: survive. But for the rest of us, that flight was more than survival. It was proof. Proof that the beast could not be killed by ridicule, by fire, or by fear. From that day on, we flew differently. Not lighter, but braver. Because once you've seen a man bring home a plane that should have fallen from the sky, you start to believe that maybe steel can carry a soul. By the summer of 1943, we had stopped trying to make the Thunderbolt dance. It wasn't built for grace, it was built to fall like a goddamn meteor. Major Hub Zemke was the first to put it into words. Standing before a map spattered with grease and cigarette ash, he told us, "Don't turn with them. Don't climb with them. Use your weight. Use your dive. Use your guns." He'd found the secret buried in all that American steel momentum was our weapon. A Thunderbolt in a dive wasn't just another fighter. It was a physical law, one that no German pilot could argue with. We began to fight differently. We stopped swirling in tight little dogfights and started hunting from the sky's edge. We would climb to 30,000 feet, higher than the Luftwaffe could breathe, and then roll inverted noses pointed straight down. The first time I dove, the air screamed against the canopy like it wanted to peel the paint off. The altimeter spun madly. The stick shivered in my hands. The world turned into a blur of blue and silver, and the plane howled as if it wanted to go faster still. 500 miles per hour, 550. Compressibility would lock the controls, but by then the guns were already spitting. 8 Brownings together didn't sound like gunfire. They sounded like thunder, a constant, consuming roar that shook your chest and silenced every doubt you'd ever had. August 17th, 1943. The Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, our first deep strike into Germany itself. I wasn't there, but every pilot who was still remembers the sky. The bombers were under siege, Messerschmitt, 110 seconds. Twin-engine destroyers loaded with cannon and rockets, forming up for their kill. Major David Schilling led his squadron of P-47 seconds from 28,000 feet, sunlight flashing off his wings as he called out, "Hammer them!" They rolled, dove, and the sky broke open. One German gunner who survived later described it perfectly. "The Americans came down like hammers from heaven. I fired at them. Good hits, the bullets struck their wings, but they did not wobble. Then they fired, and the aircraft ahead of me simply came apart." He wasn't exaggerating. At convergence range about 300 yards, all 8 guns met in a zone 6 feet across. In that space, 100 bullets a second smashed through anything unfortunate enough to exist there. Planes didn't fall, they disintegrated. One moment a Messerschmitt, the next, confetti of fire and aluminum drifting through sunlight. For the first time, we had them on the defensive. The Luftwaffe's tactics, their elegant rolls and scissors, meant nothing against a wall of lead. If you were caught in a Thunderbolt's sights, no maneuver could save you. The weapon didn't ask for precision, it demanded presence. Hold the trigger for 2 seconds, and the air ahead of you simply stopped being safe for human life. Each of our P-47 seconds carried nearly 900 pounds of ammunition, a ridiculous number, they'd said during testing. But now, we understood why. While German fighters had to break off after firing their limited cannon loads, we could stay, press, and finish. 30 seconds of sustained fire, an eternity in the air. You could write your own death sentence with less. By the end of that raid, 8 of the enemy's heavy fighters had been destroyed in under a minute. Our bombers, battered but alive, made it home. For the first time since joining the war, American pilots walked into the debriefing room with their heads high. We hadn't just survived, we'd dominated. Still, when night came, the mess hall was quiet. You could tell from the way men stirred their coffee that the sound of those guns haunted them. When you pull the trigger and see a plane dissolve, there's no triumph in it, only awe and a little fear. The kind that whispers that maybe the machine you're flying understands war better than you do. That was the moment the Thunderbolt became something else. It stopped being a machine to us and became a force, a weapon of physics and fury. We called the tactic boom and zoom, but it felt more like justice falling from heaven. The Germans started calling us Donnerschweine, thunder pigs. An insult perhaps, but not an empty one. The pigs had learned to fly, and when they came down, they brought thunder with them. Autumn of 1943 settled over Europe like a steel curtain. The air had grown colder, thinner, quieter, except for the distant growl of engines that no longer sounded German. Up there, in that silver air between 25 and 30,000 feet, the Thunderbolt had found its kingdom. And for the first time since the war began, the Luftwaffe no longer ruled it. Their losses came quietly at first, then all at once. Oberleutnant Hans Philipp, one of Germany's greatest aces, 206 victories, led his squadron on October 8, 1943, against a formation of B-17 seconds over Bremen. He'd fought in every campaign, from Poland to Russia, a man who had once seemed untouchable. But that day, at 28,000 feet, the air turned against him. His Focke-Wulf 190, perfect at medium altitude, gasped and wheezed, where the oxygen thinned. The BMW engine clawed for air that wasn't there, and above him, unseen until the last moment, came the thunder. Robert Johnson was there, the same farm boy who had once flown home in a plane made of holes. He spotted Philip's fighter below him, its nose art glinting like a memory. He rolled into the dive, 8 Brownings ready, and in seconds, the sky erupted. His report later read like a line from a machine: opened fire at 300 yards, 30-degree deflection, observed strikes along entire fuselage, enemy aircraft exploded, no parachute observed. Just like that, a legend was gone. Word of Philip's death spread through Luftwaffe mess halls faster than any victory ever had. Pilots who had once called us fat Americans now stared at the ceiling in silence, tracing cracks in the plaster with their eyes, pretending not to think about what it meant. The myth of invincibility had cracked not because of tactics, but because of altitude, endurance, and an engine that refused to suffocate. In November, a formal report landed on Hermann Göring's desk, stamped with urgency, smudged with fingerprints. The title read, Beurteilung des feindlichen Flugzeuges P-47 Thunderbolt. Assessment of the enemy aircraft. The report was clinical, but the message beneath it was panic. The Thunderbolt's ceiling exceeded 42,000 feet. Its dive speed approached the sound barrier. Its armor steel plates behind the seat, bulletproof glass, deflection shields around the engine made it a flying fortress, and worst of all, It could absorb the punishment of 3 German fighters and still return home. Goering read the numbers in silence, then reportedly muttered, "If they build these faster than we can kill them, we are finished." He was right. By early 1944, a new growl began echoing across the French countryside, deeper, heavier, impossible to mistake. The P-47D-22 had arrived, and with it came a new propeller, a 13-foot Hamilton Standard paddle blade. The pilots called it the barn door. The Germans called it the sound of despair. Those blades bit the air so violently that the tips broke the edge of sound itself, creating a low, rolling rumble that could be heard miles away, a promise and a warning. For ground troops, it became a sound you never forgot. They named it Donnerschlag, the thunderclap, a noise that rolled in before the attack, rattling helmets and windows. When you heard that, one German sergeant wrote in his diary, you prayed, because there was nothing else to do. In the air, that new prop changed everything. Suddenly, the flying milk bottle could climb. It could accelerate like a beast unleashed. One German ace, Heinz Nock, described it bitterly after an encounter near Hanover in February 1944. The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We bounced them, expecting our usual advantage. They turned into us and climbed with us. When we tried to disengage, they followed. Schmidt was caught and blown apart. These are not the same machines we laughed at last year. They were not. Somewhere over the fields of northern France, the laughter that had echoed through Luftwaffe radios in 1943 was gone. In its place came clipped, anxious transmissions, calls for reinforcements that never came, pleas for altitude they couldn't reach. The sky had changed hands, and it no longer favored the hunters. Every time I think of that winter, I remember the sound, that deep, terrifying thunder that rolled through the clouds, not angry, not wild, just inevitable. The sound of an empire's breath running out. And when I picture those German pilots, once so proud, watching our silhouettes climb past them into the sun, I think of how small laughter sounds when it has nowhere left to go. By the spring of 1944, the Thunderbolt had learned a new language, not the sharp dialogue of dogfights, but the long, deafening monologue of destruction. We stopped hunting in the clouds and began speaking to the earth in fire. The transformation was quiet at first. Engineers bolted pylons under our wings, ran cables for bombs and rockets, and handed us new checklists that smelled of ink and fresh paper. Suddenly, our sleek air-to-air killers were carrying the weight of medium bombers, 2 1,000-pounders under the wings and a 500 under the belly. The men in the hangars laughed uneasily. "She's already heavy enough to bend the runway," one mechanic muttered. But when you saw her climb, you realized the Thunderbolt didn't care. She just kept going. We learned to drop low, dangerously low, over hedgerows and railway lines. When you opened fire, you didn't hear 8 guns. You heard a single unbroken roar, like a God-breathing flame. The standard 2-second burst from those Brownings spat out 160 half-inch bullets, enough to turn a truck into dust or shred a tank's thinner top armor, and then came the rockets. 10 5-inch high-velocity shells that streaked away beneath the wings like lightning bolts, each carrying the force of a 105 mm artillery round. The first time I fired them, the cockpit shook so hard I thought the wings would tear off. But when I looked back, the road below was gone, replaced by smoke and silence. By June 6th, D-Day, the P-47 had become something else entirely. 500 of them filled the sky above Normandy that morning, layered from sea level to 30,000 feet. The invasion fleet stretched below us, thousands of ships gleaming like scales on the water, and we were their shield. German fighters tried to reach the beaches at dawn, but they never stood a chance. Oberleutnant Wolfgang Fischer of Jagdgeschwader, too, later said it plainly, "The sky belonged to the Americans. We tried to break through. 12 of us went. I was the only one to return. You couldn't climb over them. You couldn't dive under them. Their guns turned our fighters into aluminum rain. But the true horror and power of the Thunderbolt was not in the air that day. It was in what followed. We began to fly in pairs and fours, hunting convoys, rail lines, anything that moved. From the cockpit, the French countryside looked peaceful green, divided by hedgerows and narrow roads. But when you rolled in, nose down, and opened fire, peace vanished in an instant. Trucks, tanks, horses, men, all vanished beneath the roar. One burst, and the world below disintegrated. I remember the first time I hit a column head-on. The lead truck burst into flame, its fuel tank spraying fire down the road like a burning river. Behind it, the rest scattered, some into ditches, some into trees, some nowhere at all. When I pulled up, I looked back through the canopy and saw nothing left moving. The air smelled of cordite and soil. My hands were shaking. That smell, burning rubber, diesel, and earth, never left me. German ground troops began calling us Jabos fighter bombers, but soon the name wasn't enough. They said we were flying artillery, demons in the sky, machines that could appear without warning and erase entire columns in seconds. They came in low, one officer later recalled, so low you could see their faces. Then came the rockets, then the hammers. 20 trucks gone in one pass. We called it thunder, because lightning was too small a word. In June alone, the 9th Air Force's Thunderbolts claimed 651 locomotives, 3,800 trucks, 512 tanks, and over 4,000 horse-drawn vehicles. By day, nothing German could move. By night, they crept under tarps, engines off, praying for clouds. Even the feared 88mm flak guns, the ones that had terrorized bomber crews for years, struggled to track us at low altitude. We were too fast, too brutal, too relentless. The power was intoxicating, but it carried a weight none of us could quite name. You'd see the flames below and know that each plume was a life or a dozen. Some nights, sitting in the mess tent, we'd fall silent mid-sentence, the noise of the day still echoing in our skulls. One man said he could still hear the guns in his dreams, not as noise, but as rhythm, like a heartbeat that refused to stop. And yet when dawn came, we went again. Because the invasion needed us. Because every truck we destroyed meant fewer bullets at the beach, fewer tanks pushing toward the shore. The Thunderbolt had become more than a fighter. It was a promise, carved in metal, that no German army would ever again move freely under daylight. By July, the enemy had a new phrase for us, Donnerschweine auf der Erde, thunderpigs on the earth. They meant it as insult, but to us, it was a strange kind of truth. We had learned to bring the storm not just from the heavens, but from the ground up. By 1944, the real miracle of the Thunderbolt wasn't just in the sky. It was in the factories, the classrooms, the hangars, and the endless trains carrying crates of engines across America. While Europe burned, an empire of steel had risen quietly behind the ocean, an empire that built faster than war could destroy. At Farmingdale, Long Island, the Republic aviation plant never slept. The air smelled of oil, aluminum dust, and coffee gone cold on workbenches. Women with scarves tied over their hair leaned over rivet guns, their hands blistered and blackened, drilling through wing spars that could hold 40,000 pounds of stress. Teenagers who had never seen an airplane before Pearl Harbor were wiring control panels to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Every hour, on the hour, another P-47 rolled out of the assembly line, tail polished, guns aligned, propeller blades still warm from the forge. They built them faster than death could take them. In Evansville, Indiana, the farmland had become an arsenal. Cornfields gave way to hangars, hangars to foundries. 500 aircraft a month left those doors, their silver skins glinting in the Midwestern sun before being shipped to the docks, then across the Atlantic. They said that from above, Evansville looked like a heartbeat, pistons, hammers, engines, all pounding in rhythm. Each Thunderbolt required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wire, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. The engine alone, the Pratt & Whitney R2800, was a universe of precision. 2,400 machined components, every piece fitted by hand, every bolt double-checked. Yet the people who built it weren't engineers or soldiers. They were mothers, farmhands, clerks, ordinary Americans who had decided that if their sons were going to fly, they'd damn well make sure the wings didn't fail. Across the country, the same rhythm played out. In Missouri, the Lake City Arsenal was producing 30 million rounds of .50 caliber ammunition a month. Each cartridge was measured in 10,000ths of an inch, polished to feed smoothly through the guns of the Thunderbolt. By mid-1944, the U.S. was consuming 10 million rounds per month in combat, a figure so large no one could quite picture it. It wasn't just firepower anymore, it was industrial will. Even the training fields had become factories not of metal, but of men. By that year, America was graduating 30,000 pilots annually, each with over 400 hours of flight time before combat. They arrived in Europe not as recruits, but as craftsmen. They knew their aircraft the way a blacksmith knows his hammer, every vibration, every sound. They practiced formation flying until they could do it blindfolded, learned to shoot through gun camera footage frame by frame until reflex replaced thought. In the Luftwaffe, by contrast, boys were flying combat missions after less than 100 hours in the air. They were brave, but bravery couldn't make up for experience or fuel that no longer existed. The Germans mocked us once for building planes by the thousands, but in war, quantity becomes quality. The Americans had fuel to waste, ammunition to train with, spare engines stacked like firewood. The Germans had courage and memory, both beautiful, both mortal. By late 1944, the Thunderbolt was everywhere. In England's damp airfields, rows of them gleamed under camouflage nets. In France, they roared off hastily repaired runways, still littered with the wreckage of German trucks they'd destroyed the week before. In the Pacific, a new variant, the P-47 Newtons, was stretching its wings, carrying more fuel, more distance, more death across the ocean. Even the enemy began to admit what they had refused to believe. Joseph Pips Priller, the same man who once laughed and called us pregnant cows, was interviewed by German propaganda officials in 1945. His words never made it to print, they were too honest. "The Thunderbolt," he said, "is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its weapons never jam, its guns never overheat, and it carries bombs like a medium bomber. It fights like a fighter when it must, and it always comes home. But more than that, it represents something we cannot defeat. They lose 10, they build 20. We lose 1, and he is gone forever." That, in the end, was the difference. The Americans didn't just win in the air. They won in the foundries, the training fields, the rhythm of a nation that had decided it would never tire. They built a machine that turned thunder into a constant sound, the sound of endurance. Sometimes, when I think back to that era, I don't hear the guns. I hear the factories, the pounding of hammers, the hiss of welders, the chatter of rivet guns echoing like distant rain. It was the sound of ordinary people forging victory, one bolt at a time. The real thunder of the war wasn't in Europe, it was at home. By the spring of 1945, the sky had fallen quiet. The sound that had once rolled across Europe, that deep, shattering thunder of 8 Brownings, was fading into memory. The Luftwaffe was a ghost. Its airfields were craters, its fuel depots ash. The war in the air was over, long before anyone signed a document to admit it. When you flew over Germany in those final months, what you saw wasn't an enemy anymore. It was a landscape of exhaustion, blackened forests, broken rails, and airfields littered with the bones of machines. Even if they'd had fuel, they had no men left to fly. The veterans were gone, buried in foreign fields, or shot down in their own skies. What remained were boys pale, terrified, clutching controls they barely understood. Some lasted 12 seconds in the air, others never made it to altitude before our guns found them. One of those boys, a German named Klaus Brechner, survived long enough to tell the story years later. "I saw them coming," he said, 4 Thunderbolts in formation. "I tried to turn, but they were too fast. They fired from half a kilometer away. My aircraft shook like a drum. The engine exploded. I bailed out, and when I looked down, my entire squadron was gone." He was 18. The war ended a month later. That's what it came to, a storm of metal against a nation out of breath. Historians call it industrial supremacy, but to those who lived it, it felt like inevitability. The Americans no longer fought for air superiority. They owned the sky. From ground to 40,000 feet, the thunder reigned. And yet, when the silence came, it was heavier than victory. We had flown so long with the sound of our guns that silence felt unnatural. Mechanics walked the airfields, their hands idle for the first time in years. Pilots sat beside their machines, staring at the bullet holes patched 100 times over, the names painted on the fuselages: Big Annie, Oklahoma Kid, Rosie's Ride, and wondered what to do with hands that had only ever gripped throttles. When peace came, it didn't roar, it whispered. The interrogations of captured German officers revealed a final record of truth. Their files on the P-47 told the whole story of a war's humiliation in 4 dates. April 1943, unmaneuverable, minimal threat. December 1943, significant danger at high altitude. June 1944, dominant in all operations, firepower devastating. March 1945, best fighter bomber of the war, engagement inadvisable. From laughter to fear to surrender, all in 2 years. And then, in 1985, long after the fires had gone cold, former enemies met in Arizona. Old pilots with gray hair and unsteady hands gathered under a hot American sun to drink, to remember, and to forgive. Among them was Adolf Galland, the man who had once commanded the Luftwaffe's fighter arm. When asked what he thought of the Thunderbolt now, he smiled sadly and said, "We made a terrible mistake in 1943. We laughed at it. We called it a bomber, pretending to be a fighter. But the Americans did not build a European plane. They built an American one, heavy, indestructible, and endless. When I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I knew immediately we never had a chance." He paused, his glass trembling slightly in his hand. "Those guns?" he said. "We called them Roosevelt's piano. Once you heard that song, you never forgot it. Today, one of those machines sits in the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, Ohio. Polished and silent, its silver skin catches the light just as it did 80 years ago. Beneath its wings lies a small case of spent .50 caliber shells, blackened and smooth from battle. A strip of gun camera film beside them shows a Focke-Wulf disintegrating mid-air, a few blurred frames where a man's life simply ceases to exist. Below it, a plaque bears an interrogation quote from a captured German pilot. "We laughed when we first saw them. Fat, ugly American fighters that couldn't turn, couldn't climb, couldn't fight. We stopped laughing when we realized they didn't need to. They just pointed those guns, and you ceased to exist." The laughter died with his comrades. The thunder did the rest. Now, when you stand beneath that wing, the air feels heavy, as if some echo of that sound still lingers in the metal. It isn't triumph you feel, but awe. Because the P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't just an aircraft. It was a statement written in steel that endurance, when built with enough heart, becomes invincibility. And when the thunder finally faded, only silence remained. A silence vast enough to hold all the ghosts it had made.